Welcome to China in Context from the SOAS China Institute at the University of London. I'm Duncan Hewitt. Relations between China and Japan, never easy given the legacy of Japan's invasion of China in the 1930s, are at their tensest in years right now. This follows the new Japanese Prime Minister Ms Takaichi's statement in her inaugural appearance at Japan's parliament last month that if China used military force against Taiwan, which Beijing claims as part of its territory, Japan would view this as a threat to its survival and could deploy its own military in response. China was quick to describe these comments as crossing a red line and demanded a retraction, which has so far not been forthcoming, despite emergency talks between the two countries' foreign ministries and phone calls between Donald Trump and both Xi Jinping and Ms Takaichi. Beijing has also issued a travel advisory to its citizens, warning them that it's not safe to visit Japan. This has led to mass cancellations of bookings and flights from a country which accounts for some 20% of Japan's tourism market. Concerts by Japanese pop stars and screenings of Japanese films in China have also been cancelled and seafood imports blocked. Beijing has warned that Ms Takaichi's remarks hint at a revival of militarism in Japan, which since the aftermath of the Second World War has been constitutionally committed to pacifism. And the tensions come amidst rising Japanese nationalist sentiment, much of it directed at a recent influx of immigrants, including, by some estimates, more than 100,000 middle-class migrants from China. So what lies behind Ms Takaichi's comments, and how serious are the implications? To discuss these issues, who better than SOAS graduate and for more than 2 decades BBC correspondent in first Beijing, then Tokyo and most recently Taiwan, Rupert Wingfield Hayes. Rupert, thank you so much for joining us from Japan. Now, these comments by Prime Minister Takaichi don't seem completely unprecedented from a Japanese leader. So is what she said really new, and how significant are these developments?
No, it's not new in that previous Japanese Prime Ministers, Shinzo Abe, has made similar remarks before. I think the fact that she said it in Parliament, and she said it basically in her first major session as Prime Minister in Parliament, is being read by those who criticise her here in Japan as unnecessarily provocative. That she chose to say that an attack on Taiwan by China would be essentially a threat to Japan's survival. If you look at it from the Chinese point of view, it's not surprising the Chinese government has reacted in the way that it has, because in its view, Taiwan is part of China, always has been. And so why would any military action or an attempt to take back Taiwan, as they see it, be any threat to Japan, which is a different nation, right? It's a different territory. I think also you cannot see this without understanding the historical baggage that goes along with it, right? A Japanese prime minister getting up and saying anything about Taiwan is sensitive because of the history. Japan took Taiwan from China as war booty in 1895 under the Treaty of Shimonoseki, and it was relinquished by Japan at the end of the Second World War. But Taiwan is seen as a very sensitive topic between Japan and China, and always will be. And so anything a sitting Japanese prime minister says about Taiwan and its status is going to be looked at and commented on very closely by the Chinese leadership. And she must have known that when she said it.
Not least because that 1895 war was seen as such a humiliation for China when they lost these naval battles with Japan, and the following 50 years, as you say, when Taiwan was under Japanese rule. And that's also very sensitive because it's also in a way used by some people in Taiwan as evidence that Taiwan has barely been ruled by a mainland Chinese government in recent history, apart from those 3-4 years between 1945 and 1949, when the Kuomintang Nationalist Party finally retreated from the mainland to Taiwan after the Chinese Civil War.
There will be people in Taiwan who will claim that Taiwan has barely been controlled by China through its history, that it was only recognized as a province of Qing dynasty China, I think in 1885, when a provincial governor was finally appointed by the Qing dynasty. And then 10 years later, it was handed to Japan under the Treaty of Shimonoseki. But as you say, that 1895 victory that Japan had in the First Sino-Japanese War was really the start of half a century of humiliation of China at the hands of the Japanese. In 1932, they went into Manchuria. 1937, they fully invaded China and invaded the capital in Nanjing, and the Nanjing massacre. And all of these things are not ancient history, but still absolutely alive in the minds of politicians in Beijing. And, I think when it comes to China and Japan, a big part of the issue is that Japan has never really fully acknowledged and apologized all of the deeds, the very terrible deeds that Japan committed against China during that period of history. And so it is still an open sore that, yes, is very much used as a bludgeon to beat Japan with by the Chinese government, but not entirely without reason, because the Japanese post-war government really has never, not in the way that anyway near the way that Germany has acknowledged its history in the Second World War. There's a lot of denialism. There's a lot of obfuscation. There's a lot of mealy-mouthed apologies that sort of go a little way towards saying Japan did bad things, but not really going the whole way and acknowledging the really horrendous things that Japan did during the war with China.
So why do you think that she made these comments? Ms Takaichi was obviously elected on quite a nationalist platform and was running against this new party, the Sanseto, who are a very avowedly nationalistic and anti-immigration. So is she trying to appeal to the right wing to show that she's a strong leader who will stand up for Japan? I mean, is that why she's made these comments so overtly, do you think?
Yes, I mean, going after China, saying provocative things to China is not an election loser here in Japan these days. We have seen in the recent elections just how, like many places around the world, how much more nationalistic Japan is becoming. The Sanseto party, which won, I think, 14 seats in parliament in the upper house elections, came from nowhere, really, and has ran on a platform of overt Japan first politics, really mimicking Trump-like ideas of rejecting immigration, of defining Japaneseness as being very narrow, and saying we don't want any more foreigners here, and that foreigners who are here should behave themselves, and if they don't, they should be kicked out. And a big part of this is the biggest minority in Japan is now Chinese. A lot of this is covert language for saying there are too many Chinese people in Japan, and we need to stop the invasion of Chinese people into Japan. And I have to say, it is quite popular. Younger generation Japanese people are quite anti-Chinese. And that's something I've seen change over the years since I first started coming here in the early 1990s. And the older generation, the post-war generation, the boomers and the people born in the 50s and 60s were not hostile to China. In fact, there was, I think there was a real feeling of a need to rebuild relations with China. You can think of politicians in the 1970s in Japan, with the opening to China, rushing to Beijing to meet with Mao, Prime Minister Tanaka going to Beijing, and really a desire to really make good on relations with China. And that is just, one of the memes that's been going around in the week or two since Takaichi's speech is, I saw someone saying, the Japanese, social media commentator saying, finally something the Chinese Communist Party and the Japanese people agree on. We don't want any more Chinese tourists. So, the response here to China saying, don't go to Japan, to Chinese tourists, and supposedly the cancellation of all these flights and bookings of hotels is, amongst many Japanese people, has been, well, great.
Because there's a sense that these places are being overrun, like sort of Kyoto is always full of Chinese tourists in holiday season, and people who go there do sometimes just say, there's just too many people, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, one has to say, I've lived in Japan off and on for a long time. This is not a country that deals with foreigners particularly well. It never has. There's always been a sort of sense in Japan that Japanese people would really rather everybody just left them alone. But if you look at the last 10 years, I remember doing a story on this when I was the BBC correspondent in Tokyo about Prime Minister Abe setting a goal of 30 million tourists. And at that time, I think this was in about 2012, 13, there were about 10 million foreign tourists in Japan every year. I think this year it's on course to hit 38 million, and next year is expected to hit 40 million. So that's a huge increase. And a lot of those tourists come from other parts of Asia. And I think the largest number is still from Taiwan, but China is number two. And it's noticeable, right? I mean, if you go to Ginza during holiday season, during cherry blossom season, which is a big time, places feel very, very overrun. And I mean, I think the unfortunate thing is that foreign tourists tend to go to the same few places in Japan. So they'll go to Kyoto, they'll go to Tokyo, they'll go to Mount Fuji. And so those places get overrun. And so there is this word over tourism that has become popular in Japan. People likening Kyoto to Barcelona, that the locals have just lost control of their neighborhoods and their cities. And, one has to say a lot of the tourist behavior, and I'm not just pointing to Chinese people here at all. There's a lot of tourists from North America and elsewhere who behave in a very unseemly ways. And, Japan is a country that values politeness, values modesty, and people climbing up trees to take photographs of cherry blossom is not something you'd see Japanese people do. So I think there's a feeling like it's just too much.
But in terms of Ms Takaichi's own views, I mean, she's not just posturing here on issues relating to China. I mean, these are things that she has believed for a long time.
Yes, absolutely. And this is why the wording of what she said is interesting, because under Japan's pacifist constitution, Japan is not allowed to take part in wars against foreign countries.
So this is the post-war constitution which was enforced on Japan as a result of its wartime actions.
Yeah, it was basically written by a bunch of American legal scholars who got together and wrote the Constitution. And then it was handed to the Japanese emperor by Douglas MacArthur and said, this is the Constitution you're getting. And then it was put to a referendum. But because it was endorsed by the emperor, it was overwhelmingly adopted by the Japanese people after the Second World War. And in it says Japan forever renounces the right to wage war. That is Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution. Now, that has been very loosely interpreted over time, which means that Japan now has really quite large and powerful armed forces. But nevertheless, they are limited to self-defense. They are called the Japanese Self-Defense Force, and they are limited to defending the home islands. Now, in 2015, under Prime Minister Abe's premiership, there was an amendment passed through Parliament that reinterpreted the Constitution to allow Japan to take part in the defense of allies if they are attacked. And this is seen as being specifically designed for the Taiwan scenario. If Taiwan is attacked and America, which is the treaty ally of Japan, were to go to Taiwan's defense, then theoretically, Japan could say, that is an ally, we are defending our ally, and then could take part militarily in scenarios around Taiwan. And so when Takaichi says, if Taiwan was attacked, it would be a threat to the survival of Japan, she's basically saying we can take part in that sort of operation. She's saying something very clear here, which is something that China clearly does not like, the idea that there is a coalition that could come to bear in a Taiwan scenario. It wouldn't just be America, it would be potentially Japan as well, which has very significant naval resources that it could offer.
Including 23 submarines, I believe.
Including 23 very modern attack submarines, which are a significant additional contribution, in any naval scenario.
And we've seen just recently that the Japanese defense minister reaffirmed plans that Taiwan would be deploying surface-to-air missiles on this Yonaguni Island, which is about 100 kilometers off the east coast of Taiwan. And obviously Beijing, again, was angered by this and said that this was an extremely dangerous move. And we've seen in the last few weeks since Takaichi's comments, we've seen that the Chinese media has been talking about the sort of slow revival of militarism in Japan. And the Chinese foreign minister, Wang Yi, said that Japan was crossing a red line. And he actually made a comment which very much went back to what you were talking about in terms of the history. He said if the Japanese side acts willfully and makes mistake after mistake, then people and countries who uphold justice have the right to settle accounts once again regarding Japan's historical crimes and have a responsibility to prevent the resurgence of Japanese militarism. Do you have a sense, obviously you've worked in Beijing as well, do you have a sense of how deeply angry China is? I mean, is some of this just rhetoric, or are they actually rattled by what she's doing and saying?
I mean, the rhetorical response has been quite dramatic. The Chinese consul general in Osaka tweeted that Taka, in the immediate aftermath of her speech in Parliament, said that she should have her head cut off. You know, we thought that wolf warrior diplomacy had receded somewhat, but it seems it's still alive and well when it comes to Japan. Yeah, the response has been really quite dramatic and quite ferocious.
Do you think that's partly because she's a new leader and they want to sort of set their position out very quickly?
I think they certainly want to make it very clear to her that this is, you know, when America says things about Taiwan, that's one thing. It's very different when Japan starts saying things about Taiwan. I think also they feel, you know, China feels more powerful now. You know, when we worked in Beijing many years ago, China would talk about the danger of a resurgence of Japanese militarism, and everybody would sort of smirk because it just seemed so ridiculous because of Japan's pacifist constitution. But in the last 20 years, a lot of things have changed. China has become so much more powerful, not just economically, but militarily. That has freaked out the whole region. You know, everybody is afraid of China now. But Japan is the only country of scale, really. It has a very large economy. It has the economic means to build and maintain a very modern military. And so what Japan does is significant. And I think the last thing China wants to see is Xi Jinping does not want to see a strong Japan with a strong military as a counterbalance to China in the region. He wants Japan to accept that it's not going to oppose China's will in this region. The other interesting question is, to what extent is there anything behind this rhetoric from Takaichi? Because to my mind, whatever she may say about Japan potentially getting involved in a military conflict over Taiwan, I just don't see that there is the political willingness amongst the Japanese population. Hostility to China might be popular on the right, but the vast majority of Japanese people are deeply, deeply antithetical to the idea of going to war anywhere. You know, war is something that Japanese people have a real phobia of.
You do read some analysis that says that, you know, the older generation were very much pacifist, but the younger people are sort of less inclined towards pacifism, but that doesn't go very deep.
Well, I think it's superficially true that the younger generation is much more right-wing, much more hostile to China, much more nationalistic than the older generation. But then if you go a step further and you ask them, so are you willing to sign up to fight? They go quite awfully quickly. Quite apart from anything else, Japan doesn't have the young people to go fight a war. It struggles already to recruit enough people to fill the positions in the Japanese self-defense force as it stands. Now, you know, the Japanese government has said it's going to double its defense spending from 1% to 2% of GDP. And one of the questions people have is, well, what are they going to do with that money? Because if you build more ships, if you build more aircraft, if you build more missile systems, who's going to actually run them? Who's going to drive the ships? Who's going to fly the aircraft? Because there are not enough young people willing to go and join the JSDF, the Japanese Self-Defense Force, today, let alone a bigger JSDF in the future, let alone, you know, the next generation who are going to be even smaller than the current generation. And Japan is losing close to 1 million people a year because of very long-term low birth rates. Japan's population peaked at about 127 million people, and it's now shrinking by close to 1 million people a year. It is estimated that by the 2050s, Japan's population will drop below 100 million. And that will mean that you'll have a much smaller working age population supporting a very, very large elderly population. That's going to mean a huge increase in tax burden on younger people. And where is all this money going to come from to build this military, but then also to populate this military? Where are these fighting people going to come from? So I think the idea that Japan is going to become a warrior nation again is absurd.
But in the short term, it has been suggested that Beijing's fairly tough response to what the Prime Minister said about Taiwan may in some ways boost that at least superficial hardline rhetoric in Japan for strengthening the military and solidify the Prime Minister's position, and actually her government seems to be quite popular. I mean, they're getting ratings of over 60% approval, I believe, for the cabinet. Do you think that this will, in a sense, entrench her position and encourage her to take quite a tough line on China, at least rhetorically?
It's certainly working for her.
In the short term, perhaps.
In the short term, it's working for her. And it's an easy rhetorical device. Being hostile to China is, as I said, it's not going to lose you any popularity in Japan these days. And standing up for Japan is seen as, the previous Prime Minister, Ishiba, was seen as being very weak on China, quite friendly towards China, very weak generally. I mean, he was seen as a bit of a joke and an embarrassment. Meanwhile, Takaichi has come in and she's met with Trump and they seem to get along great. And she gave these gifts to Trump that Trump loved of former Prime Minister Abe's golf putter. And there were pictures of her flying with him and smiling. And so she's riding that initial honeymoon period of being close to America and getting up China's nose. And it makes her look tough. However, I do think there is disquiet, particularly amongst Japan's business community, who, while these two countries may not like each other, they have massive mutual economic relations. Japan is one of the biggest investors in China. It has enormous production in China. China is an incredibly important market for companies like Toyota. So the Japanese business community do not want too much disruption to this relationship. And, China has shown that it's willing to use economic levers to hurt countries that it has political fallings out with. It's done this with America over rare earths. And it indeed has used that against, first used this against Japan back in 2010. So,
because that's so important to, for example, the car industry that you just mentioned.
Massively important. And all of these rare earths are used for all the chips, the thousands of chips that go into automotive production these days. At the moment, it's rhetorical, and the funny thing is they're telling tourists that Japan is a dangerous place to go, and so they should stay away, which is, if you live in Japan, it is about the safest place on the planet. It's being hyped up. There are a lot of Chinese people living in Japan now. People of the older generation who probably came here in the 80s and 90s, who speak fluent Japanese, many of whom are Japanese citizens. There's a younger generation of wealthy Chinese who've come to live in Japan over the last 10 years, who do more keep themselves to themselves, are not so integrated into Japanese society, and so maybe feel some hostility from Japanese people. But on the whole, this is still an extremely safe place.
Just going back to the potential for this political tension to impact the economy, we obviously saw that China announced that it was sort of suspending seafood imports. I don't know how long that will actually go on for. They've sort of done this on occasions in the past. We saw some Japanese films that were due to be released in China had their screenings blocked, and, pop stars have been involved, forums postponed. But at the moment, clearly the main area seems to be tourism, and they've, as you say, told people it's dangerous, and people have been cancelling flights in some cases, apparently partly just because they're worried that maybe their return flight will be cancelled if there are less other people going. So it becomes a bit of a circular process maybe. But do you think that will have a significant economic impact on Japan? We've seen that Chinese tourism to Japan has been growing exponentially. I think it's gone up about 50% just from last year in the first 9 months of this year. There were 7.5 million Chinese tourists to Japan in the first 9 months of 2025. Despite some Japanese people being quite happy if there are less tourists around, is the tourism industry in Japan going to be feeling the pain, or is it actually something that won't really have much of an impact?
It might have an impact in businesses that specialize in attracting Chinese tourists. There are certain areas and there's certain shops and there's certain things that are oriented particularly towards inbound tourists from China. And so they will be affected. But overall, given the growth in tourism, I think those numbers will probably be made up with people coming from elsewhere. We've seen huge increases from Southeast Asia, from India. The Japanese yen, which is very weak at the moment, which is a huge reason for the increase in tourism, means that a lot of people from all over the world are coming to Japan because Japan is suddenly affordable. And so I don't think, I think actually a lot of Chinese people will continue to come because despite the history and despite the animosity, Chinese people seem to like Japan a great deal when they're here. They love it. They love the food, they love the hospitality, they love the scenery, they love the cleanliness and the efficiency and, you know, all the things that Japan is reputed for. So I don't think it's going to have a huge impact. On the seafood industry, I mean, that's been an on again, off again thing ever since the Fukushima nuclear disaster in 2011. It took a long time for China and South Korea to lift their bans on Japanese seafood. And I thought it was amusing to see President Lai Ching-te in Taiwan going on social media and very overtly showing that he was eating, I think, scallops from Japan and sushi from Japan. I mean, there was a sort of certain level of trolling going on there by the Taiwanese president.
And I think the Taiwanese leadership has also said that they're encouraging tourists to go to visit Japan to sort of help them get through this Chinese boycott.
Yes, I mean, my experience of living in Taiwan is Taiwanese people don't need any encouraging to come to Japan. Many of my Taiwanese friends seem to come to Japan 2 or 3 times a year. So, you know, they love Japan. And I think the feeling is absolutely mutual. It is the one place in Asia where Japanese people feel very welcome. And it's the one place in Asia that really, really does adore Japan. It's quite extraordinary.
You mentioned this younger generation of Chinese people who have actually been moving to Japan in recent years. That seems to become quite significant also in this debate within Japan about immigration. Clearly, a lot of immigration into Japan is people coming in to be, as I think they now say, trained to work at fairly low levels in big Japanese companies. But we have seen this immigration by people from China, some of them to set up companies. And I believe that they don't need to invest an enormous amount of money to get visas to live there. And after, I think, only 5 years, they can potentially become Japanese citizens. So what are the reasons that young people are coming? I mean, some of them obviously come to study. Some of them are coming, I think, to work in high-tech industry. But there seem to be other people leaving China. It's sometimes called, running from China, or, they're using the English word run in Chinese. And the run to Japan phenomenon is part of that. What is it that's attracting people, and what kind of people are coming?
It's still a broad mixture of people, because there still are the trainees coming, which is generally people from poor rural parts of China who come to Japan on these traineeship schemes. They work in agricultural, they work in industry. There's still a lot of that going on. But we've seen this significant increase in the number of young Chinese people coming here on these business visas. So a business investment visa for Japan, you could get very easily. All you needed was 5 million yen, about £30,000 in your bank account.
Yeah, $40,000.
40,000, yeah, and or one employee. And there's plenty of wealthy middle-class Chinese people for whom 5 million yen is not a huge amount of money. And they have been coming, some of them, I think, just to sort of buy property and look after their family investment portfolio, gradually moving money offshore. Japan, Tokyo has been a very good place to buy cheap property, especially with the weak yen. You can buy an older 2-bedroom apartment in Tokyo for $100,000 US, which, if you know the prices in Shanghai and Beijing, that seems very cheap. New apartments in central Tokyo are obviously much, much more expensive than that. But older neighborhoods of Tokyo, there's very affordable property. So some people are just, doing that thing of getting a place that's safe outside of China. People used to go to Australia, they used to go to America, Canada. Those places have become a little more difficult. I know a lot of people go to Thailand. Bangkok is full of young Chinese people doing Airbnb as well. But certainly Tokyo has become part of that phenomenon as well. And I've heard stories of Chinese investors coming in and buying up old apartment buildings, for example. You can buy an apartment building for maybe $500,000 US. And it's got a lot of sitting tenants in it, but they jack up the rental price on those apartments to try and deliberately get these low rent tenants out. And then they turn them into Airbnb businesses or short-term rentals, holiday rentals. obviously many of them marketed towards Chinese tourists. And he just started to cause a lot of disquiet because there have been a lot of stories in the media about it, about, an old person who's lived in an apartment for decades. Now there's a Chinese landlord and they're trying to double their rent and get them out. And they're on a fixed income, they're on their pension. And, the Japanese right-wing media obviously picking up on this and making it into a big deal. It's not a huge deal, but it is certainly happening. And so this has caused a lot of hostility, a lot of disquiet. It's been fed on by Sanseito and other right-wing parties. And it's actually now led to a change in the law. So from the end of this year, you will no longer be able to get a business investment visa on those terms. You will have to invest 30 million yen, which is 250,000 US dollars. And you will have to, I think, employ 2 full-time employees. Now, a lot of Chinese people will be able to afford that, but it's certainly starting to tighten up how easy it is to come and live in Japan. And all of these things are being done by Takaichi's government, I think, to placate the right wing, to say to people, look, we're protecting Japan. And it's following very much along the model of the United States and other countries, United Kingdom. Similar things being done there to make it a more hostile place for foreigners. And, Japan is definitely following that. I mean, there's a lot of the right-wing media here picking up on what are real but small issues, but blowing them up. Chinese drivers now come a lot as tourists to Japan and can very easily rent cars locally. Now, of course, if you have this many people coming to Japan and driving, there are going to be accidents, especially as it's driving on the other side of the road. China drives on the right, Japan drives on the left. And as we know from living in China, not every driver on the Chinese road is a particularly good driver. The driving culture is very different from here, which is a very cautious driving culture. So, a few months ago, there was a case of a Chinese driver in a large rented SUV knocking down some school children and then fleeing the scene. And of course, that is fodder for the right-wing media. It plays into all the stereotypes. And so it was made into a huge deal in the media here. It went on for days and days until this guy was caught and arrested. But, in the bigger scheme of things, there are probably far more children knocked down by elderly Japanese drivers with Alzheimer's who shouldn't be behind the wheel, which is another terrifying problem in Japan.
But at the same time, it does seem that there's actually quite a kind of growing symbiosis between Chinese high-tech industry and Japanese IT and technology, which, up till recently, at least, we can say has obviously led the way. But China is producing so many graduates, so many engineers. I believe there was a figure quoted that of the PhD students doing technology degrees at Tokyo University, 60% of them are now Chinese. Is this feeding into do you think, any kind of a long-term either cooperation or, are we going to at least see more young Chinese people working in Japanese industry, in these high-tech industries in the future?
It's the same question faced by every country that has this sort of relationship with China. You could say the same for the United Kingdom, the United States, Australia, where there has been, since the mid-1990s, there has been the growth of this very deep economic relationship with China. That is absolutely the case with Japan. It uses China as a production base. Its big corporations have global export bases in China, particularly in southern China. And, and a lot of, as with the UK, as with the United States, a lot of Chinese brightest young people have come to Japan to study at good universities, Tokyo University, one of the top universities in Asia, if not the world. I think the question now is, with China clearly under Xi Jinping deciding that it is going to pursue economic nationalism in every field, but particularly in the chip technology, renewable technology, and now in AI, here as elsewhere, there is growing fear of what this means. And there is even growing suspicion of what potentially Chinese students might be doing in these programs. Unfortunately.
Are we seeing that sort of debate in Japan? Is there a paranoia about Chinese students in the way the US has clearly had?
Not on the same level. I haven't seen it on the same level here yet. But given the atmosphere, and the atmosphere has changed very quickly in the last couple of years, I wouldn't be surprised at all if we start seeing that sort of thing as well. And, the era in which China was seen as an opportunity for Japan because of the good match between Japanese technology and capital and Chinese industrial capability and manufacturing capability, I have to say, I think that era is coming to an end. There is a big hangover because of the amount of investment that there is there. There's huge sunk costs in China by Japanese companies. But, there is certainly a desire by the Japanese government to see much of that moved elsewhere. And so, the new production bases in Vietnam, Thailand is a huge production base for Japanese companies, but also the United States. We've seen Takaichi promising huge new investments in the United States by Japanese companies, particularly in high-tech industry, during her meeting with Trump. So I think certainly on a political level, China is now seen as much higher risk than it used to be for Japanese companies. And, the Japanese government is now investing billions and billions into a Japanese AI project to try and make Japan a world leader, to try and catch up. One of the things Japan has not been good at in recent decades is producing new companies. It has very strong old companies. It has very few cutting edge new companies in AI, but also in social media, in information technology.
So they may need Chinese AI engineers, among other things, in the future. One thing that we don't seem to have seen this year, which did worry Japanese investors in the past when there was tension between Beijing and Tokyo, was that, I think in 2012 and also 2005, I believe there were fairly significant protests on the streets of Chinese cities against Japan when there were tensions over the Diaoyu or Senkaku Islands that the two countries dispute. We saw, shops and restaurants having their windows smashed and Japanese cars being attacked and things like that. But that's been conspicuous by its absence this time. Some have suggested that this reflects the fact that now it's Xi Jinping in charge in China and he does not want nationalism to spill in any way potentially out of control. From your experience, both of working in China, in Japan, indeed in Taiwan, what is your medium-term prognosis of where that relationship between China and Japan is likely to go in the next few years in the context of all the things we've seen recently?
I hesitate to make any suggestion beyond next week, but a lot of people wonder whether Takaichi will actually survive very long. She's riding the wave of her popularity at the moment, but ultimately, whether she survives as prime minister will depend on whether she can get to grips with Japan's prolonged economic woes, which, more than a decade of attempts to use large-scale monetary easing by Prime Minister Abe and his successors has not really got anywhere. I mean, Japan is still sort of stuck in this very low growth or even deflationary economy. There has been some inflation. A lot of people have been predicting Japan is back. I've heard this being bandied around recently. Japan is back because there's inflation back in Japan's economy. Wages are rising for the first time in 2 decades. The yen is weak. It's a good investment opportunity. And also Japan is a safe place to invest. So, Japan is back. Yes, to an extent. But the underlying problems that Japan faces have not fundamentally shifted. It has deep demographic issues with a shrinking working age population, as I said, increased elderly population. It doesn't get enough tax to pay for its bills. So it has extraordinarily high debt to GDP ratio. I mean, people in Britain talk about 100% debt to GDP ratio as being a problem for the bond markets. Well, I think Japan's debt to GDP ratio is somewhere around 250%. So Japan has deep economic problems. And Takaichi's response to that seems to be basically same old, same old. Let's issue more debt and let's fire more money into the economy. This has not worked in the past. And I think there's any prospect that it's going to work in the future. The inflation that Japan is currently experiencing is imported inflation. It's because of high energy prices, high food prices. It's not really the sort of positive inflation of, that there's supply side shortage in the Japanese economy. And so it's driving up prices and, you get that positive knock on of higher wages, higher spending, GDP growth. There's no sign of that really happening in Japan at the moment. In fact, most people are feeling poorer because of inflation. So, I think if Takaichi can't get to grips with those things, particularly things like the price of rice and the price of food in general, then I think her short-term honeymoon, may not last.
It could be argued that if the economy is not doing well, that this will encourage a more kind of nationalistic stance, including towards China.
The funny thing is, Duncan, is that I remember back in the days of Shinzo Abe, who was, quite a nationalist. In fact, Takaichi is thought of as being a protege of Abe. But two of the things that Abe did was push for a huge increase in tourism and to a loosening of immigration. He was really pushed forward to allow people to come to Japan to work and to have a pathway to stay, which had never happened before. And those things both contributed to an improvement in the Japanese economy towards the end of Abe's premiership, particularly large-scale increase in tourism, which has brought a lot of money into Japan, and increase in foreign labor, which has allowed Japanese companies to continue manufacturing here in Japan and not moving everything offshore. The trouble is those two policies have led to a backlash, which Takaichi is now riding to turn back the policies that her great mentor had actually implemented. So I don't know, what the answer is, because without immigration, Japan faces real problems with labor, and without increased tourism, Japan is not going to survive on domestic tourism. It is an important part of the Japanese economy now.
But in terms of the more political and diplomatic relationship between China and Japan, what do you foresee?
I foresee more of the same. I think, as I say, Japan is in a similar position to all of those countries that have got deep investments in China. Japan and Germany were the two countries that got into China early and big, and then were followed by the United States and elsewhere. But that means that the relationship with China is tremendously important, and a lot of money is still being made there by Japanese corporations. However, in the medium to longer term, it is difficult to see how this political relationship is not going to get worse. And the economic relationship is going to become more fraught because China, under Xi Jinping, appears to have decided that economic nationalism and self-reliance is more important to China than having smooth trading relationships with its biggest trading partners. And that is leading to, inevitably, tensions that are going to grow and grow. This year, China's trade surplus with the rest of the world will cross $1 trillion in 1 year. I think Japan is one of the few countries that actually has a relatively balanced trade with China, because China imports so much technology from Japan, as it does from Taiwan. But as long as Xi Jinping stays in power and continues this very clearly nationalist economic policy, which means that China wants to be increasingly not relying on Japanese technology, not relying on Taiwanese technology, not relying on inward investment from overseas, but relying on it on itself, while continuing to grow its exports. This seems to me a recipe for deep and prolonged trade tensions with its main economic partners.
Well, Rupert Wingfield Hayes, thank you so much for talking to us on China in Context.
Thank you very much, Duncan.
Well, that's all we have time for on this episode. You can find out more about SOAS China Institute events and our corporate membership scheme, and read our latest blog articles on our website, soas.ac.uk. For now, thanks for listening and goodbye.